Last time we spoke about the surrender of Japan. Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender on August 15th, prompting mixed public reactions: grief, shock, and sympathy for the emperor, tempered by fear of hardship and the occupation to come. The government's response included resignations and suicide as new leadership was brought under Prime Minister Higashikuni, with Mamoru Shigemitsu as Foreign Minister and Kawabe Torashiro heading a delegation to Manila. General MacArthur directed the occupation plan, known as Blacklist, prioritizing rapid, phased entry into key Japanese areas and Korea, while demobilizing the enemy forces. The surrender ceremony occurred aboard the Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September the 2nd, with Wainwright, Percival, Nimitz, and UN representatives in attendance. Civilians and soldiers across Asia began surrendering, and post-war rehabilitation, Indochina and Vietnam's independence movements, and Southeast Asian transitions rapidly unfolded as Allied forces tried to establish control. This episode is the aftermath of the Pacific War. Hello again and welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a reaction video to an old Alternate History Hub video on what if Pearl Harbor never happened. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for subjects I will tackle next. The Pacific War has ended. Peace has been restored by the Allies, and most of the places conquered by the Japanese Empire have been liberated. In this post-war period, new challenges would be faced for those who had won the war, and from the ashes of an empire, a defeated nation was also seeking to rebuild itself. As the Japanese demobilized their armed forces, many young boys were set to return to their homeland, even if they had previously thought that they wouldn't survive the ordeal. And yet, there were some cases of isolated men that would continue to fight on for decades even, unaware that the war had even truly ended. As we last saw, after the Japanese surrender, General MacArthur's forces began the occupation of the Japanese home islands, while their overseas empire was being dismantled by the Allies. To handle civil administration, MacArthur established the Military Government Section, commanded by Brigadier General William Christ, staffed by hundreds of U.S. experts trained in civil governance who were reassigned from Okinawa and the Philippines. As the occupation began, Americans dispatched tactical units and military government teams to each prefecture to ensure that policies were faithfully being carried out. By mid-September, General Eichelberger's 8th Army had taken over the Tokyo Bay region, and they began deploying to occupy Hokkaido and the northern half of Honshu. Then General Kruger's 6th Army arrived in late September, taking southern Honshu and Shikoku, with its base in Kyoto. In December, the 6th Army was relieved of its occupation duties. In January of 1946, it was deactivated, leaving the 8th Army as the main garrison force. By late 1945, about 430,000 American soldiers were garrisoned across Japan. If you think about it, it's an incredible number. President Truman approved inviting Allied involvement on American terms, with occupation armies integrated into a U.S. command structure. Yet, with the Chinese Civil War and Russia's reluctance to place its forces under MacArthur's control, only Australia, Britain, India, and New Zealand sent brigades, roughly 40,000 troops in southwestern Japan. Japanese troops were gradually disarmed by order of their own commanders, so the stigma of surrender would be less keenly felt by the individual soldier. In the homeland, about 1.5 million men were discharged and returned home by the end of August. Demobilization overseas, however, proceeded not so quickly. It was a long, difficult process of reparation. In compliance with General Order No. 1, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters disbanded on September the 13th and was superseded by the Japanese War Department to manage demobilization. By November the 1st, the homeland had demobilized 2.2 or so million personnel, roughly 97% of the homeland army. Yet some 6.4 million men remained to be repatriated overseas. On December the 1st, the Japanese War Ministry dissolved, and the first Demobilization Ministry took its place. The second Demobilization Ministry was established to handle the Imperial Japanese Navy's demobilization, with almost 1.3 million sailors, that's about 81% of the Navy, demobilized by December the 17th. Japanese warships and merchant ships had their weapons rendered inoperative, and suicide craft were all destroyed. 40% of naval vessels were allocated to evacuations in the Philippines, and 60% to evacuations of other Pacific islands. This effort eventually repatriated about 823,984 men to Japan by February the 15th of 1946, as reparation accelerated by October the 15th of 1946. As reparation accelerated by October the 15th, only 1.9 million men or so remained to be repatriated. Most of them were stuck in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Higashikuni's cabinet and the foreign minister Shigemitsu Mamoru managed to persuade MacArthur not to impose direct military rule or martial law over all of Japan. Instead, the occupation would be indirect, guided by the Japanese government under the emperor's direction. An early decision to feed occupation forces from American supplies and to allow the Japanese to use their own limited food stores helped ease a core fear that the imperial forces would impose forced deliveries on the people that they had conquered. On September the 17th, MacArthur transferred his headquarters from Yokohama to Tokyo, setting up primary offices on the 6th floor of the Daiichi Mutual Life Insurance Building, a rather imposing edifice overlooking the moat and the imperial palace grounds in Hibiya, the symbolic heart of the nation. While the average soldier did not fit the rapacious image of wartime Japanese propagandists, occupational personnel often behaved like neo-colonial overlords. The conquerors claimed privileges unimaginable to most Japanese. Entire trains and train compartments fitted with dining cars were set aside for the exclusive use of occupational forces. These silent, half-empty trains sped past crowded platforms, provoking ire from the Japanese passengers, who were forced to enter and exit packed cars through punched-out windows or perch on carriage roofs, couplings, and running boards, often with tragic consequences. I think we've all seen a few of these videos on YouTube of packed trains in India, for example. The luxury express coaches became irresistible targets for anonymous stone throwers. During the war, retrenchment measures had closed restaurants, cabarets, beer halls, geisha houses, and theaters in Tokyo and other large cities. Now a vast leisure industry sprang up to cater to the needs of the foreign occupants. Reopened restaurants and theaters, along with train stations, buses, and streetcars, were sometimes kept off limits to the Allied personnel, partly for security, partly to avoid burdening Japanese resources. But a costly service infrastructure was built to the occupier specifications. Facilities reserved for occupational troops bore large signs reading, "Japanese keep out," or "For Allied personnel only." In downtown Tokyo, important public buildings, requisitioned for occupation use had separate entrances for Americans and Japanese. The overall effect? A subtle but clear color bar between the predominantly white conquerors and the conquered Asiatic Japanese. Although MacArthur was ready to work through the Japanese government, he lacked the organizational infrastructure to administer a nation of over 74 million people. Consequently, on October the 2nd, MacArthur dissolved the military government section and inaugurated the General Headquarters Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, a separate headquarters focused on civil affairs and operating in tandem with the Army High Command. SCAP, as it became called, immediately assumed responsibility for administering the Japanese home islands. It commandeered every large building not burned down to house thousands of civilians, and requisitioned vast tracts of prime real estate to quarter several 100,000 troops in the Tokyo-Yokohama area alone. Amidst the rise of American privilege, entire buildings were refurbished as officers' clubs, replete with slot machines and gambling parlors installed at occupational expense. The stars and stripes were hoisted over Tokyo, while the display of the rising sun was outright banned, and the downtown area, known as Little America, was transformed into a U.S. enclave. The enclave mentality of this cocooned existence was reinforced by the arrival within the first 6 months of roughly 700 American families. At the peak of the occupation, about 14,800 families employed some 25,000 Japanese servants to ease the rigors of overseas duty. Even enlisted men in the sparse hut towns around the city lived like kings compared with ordinary Japanese. Japanese workers cleaned barracks, did kitchen chores, and handled other base duties. The lowest private earned a 25% hardship bonus until these special allotments were discontinued in 1949. Most military families quickly adjusted to a pampered lifestyle that went beyond maids and boys, including cooks, laundresses, babysitters, gardeners, and masseuses. Perks included spacious quarters with swimming pools, central heating, hot running water, and modern plumbing. Some observers compared the GHQ to the British Raj at its height. George F. Kennan, head of the State Department's policy planning staff, warned during his 1948 mission to Japan that Americans had monopolized everything that smacks of comfort, or elegance, or luxury. He further criticized what he called the American brand of Philittinism and the monumental impervious of MacArthur's staff to the Japanese people's suffering. This conqueror's mentality also showed in the bullying attitudes many top occupational officials displayed towards the Japanese of whom they had to deal with. Major Phobian Powers, MacArthur's military secretary, later said, "I and nearly all the occupational people I knew were extremely conceited and extremely arrogant and used all of our power every inch of the way." Initially, there were spasms of defiance against the occupational forces, such as anonymous stone throwing, while armed robbery and minor assaults against occupational personnel were rife in the weeks and the months after capitulation. Yet active resistance was neither widespread nor organized. The Americans successfully completed their initial deployment without really much violence, a rather astonishing feat given there was a heavily armed and vastly superior enemy operating on home terrain. The average citizen regarded the occupation as akin to a force majeure, the unfortunate but inevitable aftermath of a natural calamity. In many ways, Japan simply lay prostrate. Industrial output had fallen to about 10% of the pre-war levels, and as late as 1946, more than 13 million remained unemployed. Nearly 40% of Japan's urban areas had been turned to rubble, and some 9 million people were homeless. The war displaced, many of them had become orphans. They slept in doorways and hallways in bombed-out ruins, dugouts and packed crates, under bridges or on pavements, and crowded in the hallways of train and subway stations. As winter of 1945 descended, with food, fuel, and clothing scarce, people would freeze to death. Bonfires lit the streets to ward off the chill. "The only warm hands I have shaken thus far in Japan belong to Americans," Mark Gain noted in his diary in December of 1945. "The Japanese do not have much of a chance to thaw out, and their hands are cold and red." Unable to afford shoes, many wore straw sandals. Those with geta felt themselves privileged. The sight of a man wearing a woman's high-buttoned shoes in winter showcased the daily struggle to stay dry and warm. Shanty towns built of scrap wood, rusted metal, and scavenged odds and ends sprang up everywhere, resembling vast junkyards. It's funny to say, but the recent movie Godzilla -1 illustrated this quite well. Little tidbit of information there. I am a huge Godzilla fan, sorry. The poorest searched smoldering refuse heaps for cast-offs that might be bartered for scrap to eat or to wear. Black markets, or as the Japanese referred to them as gamichi, would be run by Japanese, Koreans, or Formosans, all trying to exploit the collapse of distribution channels and cash out in inflated prices. Tokyo became, quote, "a world of scarcity in which every nail, every rag, and even a tangerine peel had a market value." Psychologically numbed, disoriented, and disillusioned with their leaders, demobilized veterans and civilians alike struggled to get their bearings shed militaristic ideologies, and begin to embrace new values. In the vacuum of defeat, the Japanese people appeared to reject, or were ready to reject, the past, and grasp at a straw held out by the former enemy. Relations between occupier and the occupied were not smooth, however. American troops comported themselves like conquerors, especially in the early weeks and months of the occupation. Most of the violence was directed against women, with the first attacks beginning within hours after the landings of advance units. When U.S. paratroopers landed in Sapporo, an orgy of looting, sexual violence, and drunken brawling ensued. Newspaper accounts reported 931 serious offenses by GIs in the Yokohama area during the first week of occupation, including 487 armed robberies, 411 thefts of currency or goods, 9 rapes, 5 break-ins, 3 cases of assault and battery, and 16 other acts of lawlessness. In the first 10 days of occupation, there were 1,336 reported rapes by U.S. soldiers in Kanagawa Prefecture alone. Americans were not the only perpetrators. A former prostitute recalled that when Australian troops arrived in Kure in early 1946, they, quote, dragged young women into their jeeps, took them to the mountain, and then raped them. I heard them screaming for help nearly every night. Such behavior was commonplace, but news of criminal activity by occupational forces was quickly suppressed. On September the 10th of 1945, SCAP issued press and pre-censorship codes outlining the publication of reports and statistics. In the sole instance of self-help, General Eichelberger recorded in his memoirs, when locals formed vigilante groups and retaliated against off-duty GIs, the Eighth Army ordered armored vehicles into the streets and arrested the ringleaders, who received lengthy prison terms. Misbehavior ranged from black market activity, petty theft, reckless driving, and disorderly conduct to vandalism, arson, murder, and rape. Soldiers and sailors often broke the law with impunity, and incidents of robbery, rape, and even murder were widely reported. Gang rapes and other sex atrocities were not infrequent. Victims, shunned as outcasts, sometimes turned to prostitution in desperation, while others took their own lives to avoid bringing shame to their families. Military courts arrested relatively few soldiers for these offenses and convicted even fewer. Japanese attempts at self-defense were punished severely, and restitution for victims was quite rare. Fearing the worst, Japanese authorities had already prepared countermeasures against the supposed rapacity of foreign soldiers. Imperial troops in East Asia and the Pacific had behaved brutally towards women, so the government established sexual comfort stations manned by geisha, bar hostesses, and prostitutes to satisfy the lust of the occupational forces. That's how the Higashikuni cabinet put it. A budget of over 100 million yen was set aside for these recreation and amusement associations, financed initially with public funds but run as private enterprises under police supervision. Through these, the government hoped to protect the daughters of the well-born and the middle classes by turning to the lower-class women to satisfy the soldiers' sexual appetites. By the end of 1945, brothel operators had rounded up an estimated 20,000 young women and herded them into the RAA establishments nationwide. Eventually, as many as 70,000 are said to have ended up in the state-run sex industries. Thankfully, as military discipline took hold and fresh troops replaced Allied veterans responsible for the earlier crime waves, violence subsided, and the occupiers' patronizing behavior and ugly misdeeds of lawlessness was slowly declining. However, fraternization was frowned upon by both sides, and segregation was practiced in principle, with the Japanese excluded from areas reserved for Allied personnel until September of 1949, when MacArthur lifted virtually all restrictions on friendly association, stating that, quote, we're establishing the same relations between occupational personnel and the Japanese population, as exists between troops stationed in the United States and the American people. In principle, the occupation's administrative structure was highly complex. The Far Eastern Commission, based in Washington, included representatives from all 13 countries that had fought against Japan and was established in 1946 to formulate the basic principles. The Allied Council for Japan was created in that same year to assist in developing and implementing surrender terms in administrating the country. It consisted of representatives from the USA, USSR, Nationalist China, the British Commonwealth. Although both bodies were active at first, they were largely ineffectual due to unwieldy decision-making, disagreements between the national delegates, especially the Americans and the Soviets, and the obstruction of General Douglas MacArthur. In practice, SCAP, the executive authority of the occupation, effectively ruled Japan from 1945 all the way to 1952. And since it took orders only from the U.S. government, the occupation became primarily an American affair. The U.S. occupational program, carried out by SCAP, was revolutionary and rested on a two-pronged approach to ensure Japan would never again become a menace to the United States or to world peace. SCAP pursued disarmament and demilitarization with continuing control over Japan's capacity to make war. This involved destroying military supplies and installations, demobilizing more than 5 million Japanese soldiers, and thoroughly discrediting the military establishment. Accordingly, SCAP ordered the purge of tens of thousands of designated persons from public service positions, including accused war criminals, military officers, leaders of ultranationalistic societies, leaders in the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, business leaders tied to overseas expansion, governors of former Japanese colonies, and national leaders who had steered Japan into the war itself. In addition, MacArthur's International Military Tribunal for the Far East established a military court in Tokyo. It had jurisdiction over those charged with Class A crimes, the top leaders who had planned and directed the war. Also considered were Class B charges, covering conventional war crimes, and Class C charges covering crimes against humanity. Yet the military court in Tokyo wouldn't be the only one. More than 5,700 lower-ranking personnel were charged with conventional war crimes in separate trials convened by Australia, China, France, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Of the 5,700 Japanese individuals indicted for Class B war crimes, 984 were sentenced to death. 475 received life sentences. 2,944 were given more limited prison terms. 1,018 were acquitted, and 279 were never brought to trial or not even sentenced. Among these, many like General Ando Rikichi and Lieutenant General Nomi Toshio chose to commit suicide before facing prosecution. Notable cases included Lieutenant General Tanihasio, who was sentenced to death by the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal for his role in the Nanjing Massacre, Lieutenant General Sekai Takashi, who was executed in Nanjing for the murder of British and Chinese civilians during the occupation of Hong Kong, General Okemura Yasuji, who was convicted of war crimes by the tribunal, yet was immediately protected by the personal order of nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, who kept him as a military advisor for the Kuomintang. One of the most famous trials over in Manila was General Tomiyuki Yamashita, who was sentenced to death for his overall command during the Sukching Massacre, the rape of Manila, and other atrocities. Lieutenant General Homa Masaharu was likewise executed in Manila for atrocities committed by his troops under his command during the Bataan Death March. General Imamura Hitoshi was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but he considered the punishment too light, and he had a replica of the prison built in his garden, and he remained there until his death in 1968. That's by far the most Japanese thing a Japanese person has ever done. Lieutenant General Kanda Masatane received a 14-year sentence for war crimes on Bougainville, though he would only serve 4 years. Lieutenant General Aidachi Hatazo was sentenced to life imprisonment for war crimes in New Guinea and subsequently committed suicide on September the 10th of 1947. Lieutenant General Toshima Fusitaro received 3 years of forced labor for using a hospital ship to transport troops. Lieutenant General Baba Maseo was sentenced to death for ordering the Sandakan death marches, during which over 2,200 Australian and British prisoners of war perished. Lieutenant General Tanabe Moritake was sentenced to death by a Dutch military tribunal for unspecified war crimes. Rear Admiral Sakaibaru Shigematsu was executed in Guam for ordering the Wake Island Massacre, in which 98 American civilians were murdered. Lieutenant General Inoue Sadeo was condemned to death in Guam for permitting subordinates to execute 3 downed American airmen captured in Palau, though his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in 1951, and he would be released in 1953. Lieutenant General Tachibane Yoshio was sentenced to death in Guam for his role in the Chichijima incident, in which 8 American airmen were cannibalized. By mid-1945, due to the Allied naval blockade, the 25,000 Japanese troops on Chichijima had run low on supplies. However, although the daily rice ration had been reduced from 400 grams per person to about 240 grams, the troops were not at risk of starvation. In February and March of 1945, in what would be called, of course, the Chichijima incident, Tachibana Yoshio's senior staff, well, they turned to cannibalism. 9 American airmen had escaped from their planes after being shot down during a bombing raid over Chichijima. 8 of them were captured. The 9th, the only one to evade capture, was future U.S. President George H.W. Bush, then 20 years old. Yeah, go figure. Over several months, the prisoners were executed, and reportedly by the order of one Major Matoba Seo, their bodies were butchered by the division's medical orderlies, with the livers and their other organs consumed by the senior staff, including Matoba's superior, Tachibana. In the Yokohama war crimes trials, Lieutenant Generals Inoa Mazuzumi and Yokoyama Azuzumi were convicted for their complicity in vivisection and other human medical experiments performed at Kyushu Imperial University on downed Allied airmen. The Tokyo war crimes trial, which had begun in May of 1946 and lasted 2.5 years, resulted in the execution by hanging of Generals Tohara Kenji and Itagaki Seishiro, and former Prime Ministers Hiroto Koki and Tojo Hideki, for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace, specifically for the escalation of the Pacific War and permitting the inhumane treatment of prisoners of war. Also sentenced to death were Lieutenant General Muto Akira for his role in the Nanjing and Manila massacres, General Kimura Heitaro for planning the war strategy in China and Southeast Asia, and for his lack of trying to prevent atrocities against prisoners of war in Burma, and General Matsue Awane for his involvement in the rape of Nanjing. The 7 defendants who were sentenced to death were executed at Sugamo Prison in Ikebukuro on December the 23rd of 1948. 16 others were sentenced to life imprisonment, including the last field marshal, Hata Shinroku, Generals Araki Sadio, Minami Hiro, and Imuzu Shojiro, Admirals Shimada Shigetaro, former Prime Ministers Hironuma Kiyachiro and Koizo Kunaki, the Marquis Kido Koichi, and the Colonel Hashimoto Kingoro, a major instigator of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Additionally, former foreign ministers Togo Shigenori and Shigemitsu Mamoto received 7 and 20-year sentences, respectively. The Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Forces also held their own trials of Japanese war criminals, including the Khabarovsk war crimes trials, which tried and found guilty some members of Japan's Bacteriological and Chemical Warfare Unit, known as Unit 731. However, those who surrendered to the Americans were never brought to trial, as MacArthur granted immunity to Lieutenant General Ishishiro and all the members of his research units in exchange for germ warfare data derived from human experimentation. And I gotta say it here, if you'd really like to learn more about what I like to call Japan's Operation Paperclip, whereupon the U.S. grabbed many scientists from Unit 731, well, I have an exclusive podcast on that. You can go over to my Patreon account or my YouTube membership and just look up my episode titled Unit 731. It's a lot darker than you could even imagine. So the SCAP turn to democratization began with the drafting of a new constitution in 1947, addressing Japan's enduring feudal social structure. In the charter, sovereignty was vested in the people, and the emperor was designated a symbol of the state and the unity of the people, deriving his position from the will of the people, in whom resides sovereign power. Because the emperor now possessed fewer powers than European constitutional monarchs, some have gone so far as to say that Japan became a republic, in fact, if not name. Yet the retention of the emperor was, in fact, a compromise that suited both those who wanted to preserve the essence of the nation for stability and those who demanded that the emperor system, though not necessarily the emperor, should be expunged. In line with the democratic spirit of the new constitution, the peerage was abolished, and the two-chamber diet, to which the cabinet was now responsible, became the highest organ of state. The judiciary was made independent, and local autonomy was granted in vital areas of jurisdiction, such as education and the police. Moreover, the Constitution stipulated that people shall not be prevented from enjoying any of the fundamental human rights, that they shall be respected as individuals, and that their right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness shall be the supreme consideration in legislation. Its 29 articles guaranteed basic human rights, equality, freedom from discrimination of the basis of race, creed, sex, social status, or family origin, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. Finally, in its most controversial section, Article 9, the Peace Clause, Japan renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation and vowed not to maintain a military force and other war potential. To instill a thoroughly democratic ethos, reforms touched every facet of the society. The dissolution of the zaibatsu decentralized economic power. The 1945 Labor Union Law and the 1946 Labor Relations Act guaranteed workers the rights to collect in action. The 1947 Labor Standards Law established basic working conditions for men and women, and the revised Civil Code of 1948 abolished the patriarchal household and enshrined sexual equality. Reflecting core American principles, SCAP introduced a 6-3-3 schooling system, 6 years of compulsory elementary education, 3 years of junior high, and an optional 3 years of senior high school, along with the aim of secular, locally controlled education. More crucially, ideological reform followed. Censorship of feudal material and media, revision of textbooks, and prohibition of ideas glorifying war, dying for the emperor, or venerating war heroes. With women enfranchised and young people shaped to counter militarism and ultranationalism, rural Japan was transformed to undermine lingering class divisions. The land reform program provided for the purchase of all land held by absentee landlords, allowed resident landlords and owner farmers to retain a set amount of land, and required that the remaining land be sold to the government so it could be offered to existing tenants. In 1948, amidst the intensifying tensions of the Cold War, that would soon culminate in the Korean War, the occupation's focus shifted from demilitarization and promoting democracy towards economic recovery and ultimately the remilitarization of Japan, a shift known as the reverse course. The country was thus rebuilt as the Pacific region's primary bulwark against the spread of communism. An economic stabilization program was introduced, including a 5-year plan to coordinate production and target capital through the Reconstruction Finance Bank. In 1949, the anti-inflationary Dodge Plan was adopted, advocating balanced budgets, fixing the exchange rate at about 360 yen to the dollar, and ending broad government intervention. Additionally, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry was formed and supported the formation of conglomerates centered around banks, which encouraged the reemergence of basically the weakened zaibatsu, including Mitsui and Mitsubishi. By the end of the occupation era, Japan was on the verge of surpassing its 1934 to 1936 levels of economic growth. Equally important was Japan's rearmament in alignment with American foreign policy. A national police reserve of about 75,000 was created with the outbreak of the Korean War. By 1952, it was expanded to 110,000 and was renamed the Self-Defense Force after the inclusion of an Air Force. However, the reverse course also facilitated the reestablishment of conservative politics and the rollback of gains made by women and the reforms of local autonomy and education. As the occupation progressed, the Americans permitted greater Japanese initiative, and power gradually shifted from the reformers to the moderates. By 1949, the purge of the right came under review, and many who had been condemned began returning to influence, if not to the Diet, then behind the scenes to power. At the same time, Japanese authorities, with MacArthur's support, began purging left-wing activists. In June of 1950, for example, the central office of the Japan Communist Party and the editorial board of the Red Flag were purged. The gains made by women also seemed to be reversed. Women were elected to 8% of the available seats in the first lower house election in 1946, but to only 2% in 1952, a trend not reversed until the so-called Madonna boom of the 1980s. Although the number of women voting continued to rise, female politician making remained more superficial than might be imagined. Women's employment also appeared little affected by labor legislation. Though women formed nearly 40% of the labor force in 1952, they earned only about 45% as much as men. Indeed, women's attitudes towards labor were influenced less by the new ethos of fulfilling individual potential than by traditional views of family and the workplace responsibilities. In the areas of local autonomy and education, substantial modifications were made to the reforms. Because local authorities lacked sufficient power to tax, they were unable to realize their extensive powers, and as a result, key responsibilities were transferred back to national jurisdiction. In 1951, for example, 90% of villages and towns placed their police forces under the control of the newly formed National Police Agency. Central control over education was also gradually reasserted. In 1951, the Yoshida government attempted to reintroduce ethics classes, proposed tighter central oversight of textbooks, and recommended abolishing local school board elections. By the end of the decade, all these changes had been implemented. Now, taking a step back from Japan, the Soviet occupation of the Kuril Islands and the Habomai Inlets were completed with Russian troops fully deployed by September 5th, 1945. Immediately after the onset of the occupation, amidst a climate of insecurity and fear marked by reports of sporadic rape and physical assault and widespread looting by occupying troops, an estimated 4,000 islanders fled to Hokkaido, rather than face the uncertain reparation. As Soviet forces moved in, they seized or destroyed telephone and telegraph installations and halted ship movements into or out of the islands, leaving residents without adequate food and other winter provisions. Yet, unlike Manchuria, where Japanese civilians faced widespread sexual violence and pillage, systemic violence against the civilian population on the Kurils appeared to have been exceptional. A series of military government proclamations assured islanders of safety so long as they did not resist Soviet rule and carried on normally. However, these orders also prohibited activities not explicitly authorized by the Red Army, which imposed many hardships on the civilians. Residents endured harsh conditions under Soviet rule until the late parts of 1948, when Japanese reparation out of the Kurils was finally completed. The Kurils posed a special diplomatic problem, as the occupation of the southernmost islands, the Northern Territories, ignited long-standing disputes between Tokyo and Moscow that continues to impede normalization of relations to this very day. Although the Kurils were promised to the Soviet Union in the Yalta Agreement, Japan and the United States argued that this did not apply to the Northern Territories, since they were not technically part of the Kuril Islands. A substantial dispute regarding the status of the Kuril Islands arose between the United States and the Soviet Union during the preparation of the Treaty of San Francisco, which was intended as a permanent peace treaty between Japan and the Allied powers of World War II. The treaty was ultimately signed by 49 nations in San Francisco on September 8th of 1951, and it came into force on April 28th of 1952. It ended Japan's role as an imperial power, allocated compensation to the Allied nations and former prisoners of war who had suffered Japanese war crimes, ended the Allied post-war occupation of Japan, and returned full sovereignty to Japan. Effectively, the document officially renounced Japan's treaty rights derived from the Boxer Protocol of 1901 and its rights to Korea, Formosa, and the Pescadores, the Kuril Islands, the Spratly Islands, Antarctica, and South Sakhalin. Japan's South Seas Mandate, namely the Mariana Islands, Marshall Islands, and Caroline Islands, had already been formally revoked by the United Nations on July 18th of 1947, making the United States responsible for administration of those islands under a UN trusteeship that established the trust territory of the Pacific Islands. In turn, the Bonin, Volcano, the Ryukyu Islands were progressively restored to Japan between 1953 and 1972, along with the Senkaku Islands, which were disputed by both communist and nationalist China. In addition, alongside the Treaty of San Francisco, Japan and the United States signed a security treaty that established a long-lasting military alliance between them. Although Japan renounced its rights to the Kurils, the U.S. State Department later clarified that, quote, the Habomai Islands and the Shikotan are properly part of Hokkaido, and that Japan is entitled to sovereignty over them. Hence why the Soviets refused to sign the treaty. Britain and the United States agreed that territorial rights would not be granted to nations that did not sign the Treaty of San Francisco, and as a result, the Kuril Islands were not formally recognized as Soviet territory. A separate peace treaty known as the Treaty of Taipei, formerly the Sino-Japanese Peace Treaty, was signed in Taipei on April 28th of 1952 between Japan and the Kuomintang, and on June 9th of that year, the Treaty of Peace between Japan and India followed. Finally, Japan and the Soviet Union ended their formal state of war with the Soviet-Japanese Joint Declaration of 1956, though this did not settle the Kuril Islands dispute. And even after all of these formal steps, Japan as a nation was not in a formal state of war, but some Japanese continued to believe the war was still going on. Those who held out after the surrender came to be known as the Japanese holdouts. Captain Oba Sakai and his medical company participated in the Saipan campaign beginning on July the 7th of 1944 and took part in what became known as the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. After 15 hours of intense hand-to-hand combat, almost 4,300 Japanese soldiers were dead, and Oba and his men were presumed to be dead amongst them. In reality, however, he survived the battle and gradually assumed command of over 100 additional soldiers. Only 5 men from his original unit survived the battle, 2 of whom died in the following months. Oba then led over 200 Japanese civilians deeper into the jungles to evade capture, organizing them into mountain caves and hidden jungle villages. When the soldiers were not assisting the civilians with survival tasks, Oba and his men continued their battle against the garrison of the U.S. Marines. He used the 1,500-foot Mount Tapochau as their primary base, which offered a 360-degree view of the island. From their base camp on the western slope of the mountain, Oba and his men occasionally conducted guerrilla-styled raids on American positions. Due to the speed and stealth of these operations and the Marines' frustrated attempts to find him, the Saipan Marines eventually referred to Oba as the Fox. Oba and his men held out on the island for 512 days, or about 12 months. On November the 27th of 1945, former Major General Amo Umahachi was able to draw out some of the Japanese in hiding by singing the anthem of the Japanese infantry branch. Amo was then able to present documents from the defunct IGHQ to Oba, ordering him and his 46 remaining men to surrender themselves to the Americans. On December the 1st, the Japanese soldiers gathered on Tobacho, and they sang a song of departure to the spirits of the war dead. Oba led his people out of the jungle, and they presented themselves to the Marines of the 18th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Company. With great formality and dignity, Oba surrendered his sword to Lieutenant Colonel Howard Kirgis, and his men surrendered their arms and colors. On January the 2nd of 1946, 20 Japanese soldiers hiding in a tunnel on Corregidor Island surrendered after learning the war had ended from a newspaper found while collecting water. In that same month, 120 Japanese were routed after a battle in the mountains 150 miles south of Manila. In April, during a 7-week campaign to clear Lubang Island, 41 more Japanese emerged from the jungle, unaware that the war had ended. However, a group of 4 Japanese continued to resist. In early 1947, Lieutenant Yamaguchi Ioe and his band of 33 soldiers renewed fighting with a small Marine garrison on Peleliu, prompting reinforcements under Rear Admiral Charles Pownall to be brought to the island to hunt down the guerrilla group. Along with them came former Rear Admiral Sumikawa Michio, who ultimately convinced Yamaguchi to surrender in April after almost 3 years of guerrilla warfare. Also in April, 7 Japanese emerged from Palawan Island, and 15 armed stragglers emerged from Luzon. In January of 1948, 200 troops surrendered on Mindanao, and on May the 12th, the Associated Press reported that 2 unarmed Japanese soldiers had surrendered to civilian policemen in Guam the day before. On January the 6th of 1949, 2 former IJN soldiers, machine gunners Matsudo Rikyo and Yabakage Kufuku, were discovered on Iwo-jima, and they surrendered peacefully. In March of 1950, Private Akatsu Yuchi surrendered in the village of Roque, leaving only 3 Japanese still resisting on Lubang. By 1951, a group of Japanese on Anatahan Island refused to believe that the war was over, and they resisted every attempt by the Navy to remove them. This group was first discovered in February of 1945, when several Camoros from Saipan were sent to the island to recover the bodies of a Saipan-based B-29. The Camoros reported that there were about 30 Japanese survivors from 3 ships sunk in June of 1944, one of which was a Okinawan woman. Personal aggravations devolved from the close confines of a small group on a small island and from tuba drinking. Amongst the holdouts, 6 of 11 deaths were the result of violence, and 1 man displayed 13 knife wounds. The presence of only 1 woman, Higa Kazuko, caused considerable difficulty as she would transfer her affections amongst at least 4 men after each of them mysteriously disappeared, purportedly swallowed by the waves while fishing. I'm sure a movie could be made on that story. According to the more sensational versions of the Anatan tale, 11 of the 30 Navy sailors stranded on the island died due to violent struggles over her affections. In July of 1950, Higa went to the beach when an American vessel appeared offshore and finally asked to be removed from the island. She was taken to Saipan aboard the Miss Susie, and upon arrival told authorities that the men on the island did not believe that the war was over. As the Japanese government showed interest in the situation on Atahan, the families of the holdouts were contacted in Japan and urged by the Navy to write letters stating that the war was indeed over and that these holdouts should probably surrender. The letters were dropped by air on June the 26th and ultimately convinced the holdouts to give themselves up. Thus, 6 years after the end of World War II, Operation Removal commenced from Saipan under the command of Lieutenant Commander James Johnson aboard the Navy tug USS Kokaba. Johnson and an interpreter went ashore by rubber boat and formally accepted the surrender on the morning of June the 30th of 1951. The Anatahan female fatale story later inspired the 1953 Japanese film Anatahan, which I was not aware was a thing, so oopsie doops, guess they beat me to it, and the 1998 novel Cage on the Sea. In 1953, Murara Susumu, the last holdout on Tianjin, was finally captured. The next year, on May the 7th, Corporal Sumada Soichi was killed in a clash with Filipino soldiers, leaving only 2 Japanese still resisting on Lubang. In November of 1955, Seaman Kinoshita Noboru was captured in Luzon's jungles, but soon committed suicide rather than return to Japan in defeat. That same year, 4 Japanese airmen surrendered at Hollandia in Dutch New Guinea, and in 1956, 9 soldiers were located and sent home from Morotai, while 4 men surrendered in Mindoro. In May of 1960, Sergeant Ito Masashi became one of the last Japanese to surrender at Guam after the capture of his comrade Private Minagawa Bonzo, but the final surrender at Guam would later come with Sergeant Yoko Sochi. Sergeant Yoko Sochi survived in the jungles of Guam by living for years in a elaborately dug hole, subsisting on snails and lizards, a fact that, while undignified, showcased his ingenuity and resilience and earned him a warm welcome on his return back to Japan. His capture was not heroic. In the traditional sense, he was found half-starving by a group of villagers who were foraging for shrimp in a stream. And the broader context included his awareness as early as 1952 that the war was over. He explained that the wartime Bushido Code, emphasizing self-sacrifice or suicide rather than self-preservation, had left him fearing that repatriation would label him a deserter and likely lead to an execution. Emerging from the jungle, Yokai also became a vocal critic of Japan's wartime leadership, including Emperor Hirohito, which fits a view of him as a product of and a prisoner within his own education, military training, and the censorship and propaganda of the era. When asked by a young nephew how he survived for so long on an island just a short distance from a major American air base, he simply replied, "I was really good at hide and seek." That same year, Private Kozuka Kinshichi was killed in a shootout with Philippine police in October, leaving Lieutenant Onoda still resisting on Lubang. Lieutenant Onoda had been on Lubang since 1944, a few months before the Americans retook the Philippines. The last instructions he had received from his immediate superior ordered him to retreat to the interior of the island and harass the Allied occupying forces until the Imperial Japanese Army eventually returned. Despite efforts by the Philippine Army, letters and newspapers left out for him, radio broadcasts, and even a plea from Onoda's brother, he did not believe the war was over. Well, to be blunt, he alleged this in stories afterwards, but a lot of people think that he knew. On February the 20th of 1974, you heard that right, 1974, Onoda encountered a young Japanese university dropout named Suzuki Norio, who was traveling the world and had told friends that he planned to look for Lieutenant Onoda, infamously referred to as the Panda or the Abominable Snowman. The two became quick friends, but Onoda stated that he was still awaiting orders from one of his commanders to surrender. On March the 9th of 1974, Onoda went to an agreed-upon place and found a note left by Suzuki. Suzuki had brought along Onoda's former commander, Major Taniguchi, who delivered the oral orders for Onoda to surrender. Intelligence officer, Second Lieutenant Onoda then emerged from the Bang's jungle with his .25 caliber rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, and several hand grenades. He surrendered 29 years after Japan's formal surrender, and 15 years after being declared legally dead in Japan. When he accepted that the war was over, he wept openly. He received a hero's welcome upon his return to Japan in 1974. I would like to just add that he actually killed a few people and harassed local farmers where he was for many years. He was a very violent person. But upon returning, the Japanese government offered him a large sum of money in back pay, which he refused. When money was pressed on him by well-wishers, he donated it to the Yasukuni Shrine. Onoda was reportedly unhappy with the attention and what he saw as the withering of traditional Japanese values. He wrote the famous No Surrender, My 30-Year War, a best-selling autobiography published in 1974. Yet, the last Japanese to surrender would be Private Nakimura Teruo, an Amis Aborigine from Formosa and a member of the Takasego Volunteers. Private Nakimura Teruo spent the tail end of World War II with a dwindling band of Morotai, repeatedly dispersing and reassembling in the jungle as they hunted for food. The group suffered continuous losses to starvation and disease, and survivors describe Nakimura as highly self-sufficient. He left to live alone somewhere in Morotai's highlands between 1946 and 1947, rejoined the main group in 1950, and then he disappeared again for a few years. Nakimura hinted in print that he fled into the jungle because he feared the other holdouts might try to murder him. He survived for decades beyond the war, eventually being found by 11 Indonesian soldiers. The emergence of an indigenous Taiwanese soldier amongst the search party embarrassed Japan as it sought to move past its imperial past. Many Japanese felt Nakimura deserved compensation for decades of loyalty, only to learn that his back pay for 3 decades of service amounted to about 68,000 yen. That's like 1,000 USD or something today. Nakimura's experience of peace was complex. When a journalist asked him how he felt about basically wasting 3 decades of his life on Morotai, he replied that the years had not been wasted. He had been serving his country. Yet the country he returned to was Taiwan, and upon disembarking in Taipei in early January of 1975, he learned that his wife had a son he had never met, and that she had remarried a decade after his official death. Nakimura eventually lived with a daughter, and his story concluded with a bittersweet note when his wife reconsidered and got back together with him. It's kind of like the end of the movie Castaway, but better. Several Japanese soldiers joined local communist and insurgent groups after the war to avoid surrender as well. Notably, in 1956 and 1958, 2 soldiers returned to Japan after service in China's People's Liberation Army. 2 others who had defected with a larger group to the Malayan Communist Party around 1945 laid down their arms in 1989, then returned home the next year. But that is all for today. Fear not, I will still be providing a few more goodies over the next few weeks, not leaving you just yet. Again, a lot of what I'll be releasing soon is from my exclusive podcast series. That's over on my YouTube membership or on my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/The Pacific War Channel. And I'm going to keep it to the Pacific War related ones, as my exclusive podcast series goes into every type of history and sometimes outside of history. I have some Lord of the Rings stuff. Definitely the first one that will be coming your way is, why did Emperor Hirohito actually surrender? Really hope you guys are looking forward to that. Until then, if you need your fix, you know where to find me. I'm over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast. We just entered the Second Sino-Japanese War. So if you want to see more of a micro look at the China War, well, head over there. Till next time, this has been Craig from the Pacific War Channel and the narrator of the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, over and out.